And uh, notoriously, in 1924, the Ku Klux Klan had a major convention in Oakland at the Oakland Convention Center. They wanted to march in the 4th of July parade. Oakland did not allow them, but Richmond invited them. So that picture you see over there is downtown Richmond in 1924 on the 4th of July. In World War II, more Midwesterners showed up. Southern European Americans, from the South, and African Americans from the South start showing up. Chicanos and Native Americans from New Mexico and Texas also start to arrive to work in the shipyards and other industries. The federal government, in response to the institutional violence of European Americans against African Americans, caused the federal government to step in and build segregated housing and social facilities. And this is throughout the Bay Area. And those became the roots of many of the African American communities, and in Richmond, in particular, in the south side of Richmond, and then later on in North Richmond. And of course, we know notoriously Japanese Americans were placed in concentration camps only on the West Coast. Hawaiian Japanese Americans were not, but those from California, Oregon, and Washington were. And a little known story is that Italian Americans also were prohibited and restricted. I should say Italian nationals were restricted and prohibited along the coastline. And then in the late 40s, because of all the industrial development, unions started organizing, and there were a number of strikes that occurred, especially at the refinery, and the Richmond police aided the refinery in attacking the striking workers. And this was a theme that we would see throughout the history of Richmond. And then in the 50s to 60s, of course, African-American civil rights movement was very active in Richmond. Picket lines on stores that wouldn't hire African Americans. And Martin Luther King came to the Richmond Auditorium to speak in 1962. And then Richmond in 1966 of April had the second African American uprising on the West Coast after Watts. Watts was August of 65, Richmond was April of 66. And then, like much of the nation, there was another one in 1968. And this really accelerated white flight that had already started in the late 50s and early 60s. And it led to a massive divestment from central Richmond, downtown Richmond, and with devastating effects. And then, of course, in response to a variety of oppressions, the Black Panther Party and the Brown Berets were very active in Richmond. And in fact, the first edition of the Black Panther Party newspaper was printed primarily to advertise a rally in North Richmond to protest the Contra Costa Sheriff's Department shooting a young African-American man, 17-year-old guy named Denzel Dowell, in the back as he was running away from them. Next slide, please. And so this is a rapid history lesson here. This map you see are toxic sites throughout Richmond. Of course, we can get in much more detail about that, but you see there's a pattern of polluted sites in Western Richmond and Southern Richmond. So in the 40s and 50s, the GI Bill and the racist financial industry of the United States redlined many of the neighborhoods, creating segregated African-American neighborhoods, both in South Richmond and in North Richmond. In the 50s, we saw the deindustrialization that was happening all across the country occurred in Richmond, and started with the closing of the shipyards. And then we saw that the Ford Motor Company shut down, moved down to Fremont. Later, it became a Nissan plant and is now the Tesla plant. In the 60s, we saw Richmond depopulating due to white flight. And this opened up the downtown area, central Richmond, to African Americans for the first time. And then the Richmond Unified School District was created for the white suburbs like El Sobrante and Pinole to feed off of Richmond's tax base to subsidize their schools. And it was only in the last year that we actually got district elections in that school district. And then in 1970s, like I said, when they started closing down the businesses in downtown Richmond and the divestment, they created what is now known as the Hilltop Mall. And the Chamber of Commerce of Richmond facilitated this on what used to be a Chevron tank farm, where they had oil storage tanks and still contaminated land. That's where they built the mall. And they moved their businesses from downtown Richmond. And the 70s is also when we began to see the modern Mexicano migration into Richmond that has continued up until recent times. And then the redevelopment agency of the city of Richmond chose to redevelop the former shipyards into housing development that we now call Marina Bay. And it became an engine for gentrification. And they allowed the downtown of Richmond to deteriorate. And especially in the 80s when Reagan was president, and he had an illegal fundraising scheme where the CIA allowed the Contras and other actors in the Central American wars ramp up cocaine importation and production. And this led to the rise of crack. And then the gun industry changed its product line to semi-automatic weapons instead of revolvers and rifles. And we got assault weapons, and that led to violence, which then led to mass incarceration. And California built more prisons between 1980 and 1995 than they had from 1850 to 1980. Next slide. And so moving forward, in the 1980s is also when we saw the environmental justice movement emerge in Richmond. And this was the one time in Richmond's history, the 1980 census, when African Americans actually became a majority at 52% of the population. And the crack, the guns, and police violence, we had a notorious group of violent police officers known as the Cowboys, began their devastation in Richmond. And not surprisingly, Chevron got permission to expand its production. And we saw that Latino and Laotian migration started increasing. In the 1990s, there was a general chemical sulfuric acid leak that sent thousands of people to the hospital. And the environmental justice community came together and negotiated a settlement, and led to actually the creation of the Center for Health in North Richmond. In 2002, the Cinco de Mayo Richmond police riot led to the emergence of Latino political action and the creation of the Richmond Progressive Alliance, unifying a range of different political movements. And this was the first time when Latinos became a plurality in the Richmond population. And because of the environmental justice movement, the Air District passed its first anti-flaring rule, and it became the first one in the United States. Then, of course, in the 2010s, we saw the notorious 2012 Chevron explosion and fire. The U.S. Chemical Safety Board came in and pointed the finger at management and their neglect of the machinery that led to this massive fire. Over 15,000 people went to the hospital. That hospital is now closed. The president of the board of the hospital happened to be the lobbyist for Chevron. So he fought to make sure that that hospital was not there anymore, so it could not document the injuries to people. A year later, there was a mass march. Over 3,000 people marched on Chevron. 209 people were arrested for trespassing. Richmond, for the first time in its history, sued Chevron based on that fire and other damages. And the progressive movement helped mobilize people to defeat a casino project at Point Molate, which used to be a naval fuel depot, fueling naval ships from World War II all the way through the Vietnam War. And then 2014, the Chevron modernization project was approved, And yet Chevron dumped $3.5 million into the local race, and all of their candidates lost. And then the Richmond Our Power Coalition, the BackMed Network, Sunflower Alliance were formed in the wake of this explosion and the organizing that occurred at that time. There were various crude by rail projects, with the Bakken crude and tar sands being targeted for our communities, but we defeated those projects in Benicia and in San Luis Obispo. Those trains would have come down through Richmond, right through downtown Richmond, on their way to San Luis Obispo. So many people organized to defeat those projects. And then a lame duck city council approved weakening of the cleanup standards at the old Stauffer chemical site, which is now the AstraZeneca Superfund site. Yes, AstraZeneca, the same people who created the COVID vaccine, they are investors and own the land there. And then in the 2020s, most recently, the Air District adopted the Cat Cracker Rule 6-5, which will, when finally implemented, will reduce the toxic particulate emissions from the catalytic cracker unit at the Chevron refinery and the PBF refinery by up to 70%. And then under the threat of a lawsuit or lawsuits, district elections for the city council and for the West County Unified School Board were established. Both of them were based on underrepresentation of Latinos in the Richmond City Council and the school board. And then the Richmond Progressive Alliance in 2020 was voted in as a majority, and many things are moving forward now. Reimagining Public Safety Task Force recently, just in the last 3 months, successfully got the city council to reallocate $6.3 million away from the Richmond Police Department budget and into prevention and intervention programs. And then CBE and our allies are currently working, researching, and planning on decommissioning refineries. And so a decommissioning California refineries report was issued in 2019. And there are a number of research and advocacy efforts that are currently going on. Next slide. And so for those of you who are more interested in digging deeper into why Richmond became this kind of city where we were able to fight back and defeat transnational corporations, I put together this reading list for your interest. Very important book is called The Second Gold Rush, Oakland and the East Bay in World War II, by Marilyn Johnson. There's a lot of Richmond history in that book because the shipyards. And then a very key book on the history of the African-American community in Richmond was put together by Shirley Ann Wilson Moore. She's a professor up at Sacramento State, called To Place Our Deeds. And then telling the story of the emergence and the development of the Richmond Progressive Alliance is Refinery Town, Big Oil, Big Money, and the Remaking of an American City by Steve Early. And then our former mayor and current city council member, Gail McLaughlin, put together her own memoirs, and it's called Winning Richmond, How a Progressive Alliance Won City Hall. And then an important book for everybody to understand why we have persistent poverty and discrimination in the United States should look at Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, particularly through redlining and the role of the financial industry and government in that. So that's my presentation. And perhaps at this time, Betty, this is when we can move into doing the polls.
Yeah, that would be great. So Andy, if you could bring up the first poll. So the question is, do you know the location of historically redlined neighborhoods in your city? And maybe after each question, Andres, if you want to maybe talk about why you included that as a question.
Sure. Yeah, and I included this question because a lot of times people move into a community and they don't know the history of that community, and they really don't know why communities are segregated, or why certain parts of town are poor or underserved. And this poll reflects that reality, that a lot of people really don't know the history of place where they currently live. And that's, I think, something that's really important for people to understand, because it's one thing to parachute into a community and live there and engage in the community. But if you really don't know the history of that community, you can step in some landmines. So cool. Let's move into the next question.
Oh.
Yeah.
I accidentally ended this one. Can we do it again? There we go.
Okay. Do you live in one of those red line neighborhoods? And if you don't know, it's kind of it begs the question. All right. People are answering fast and furiously.
Andy, if are you sharing these results?
I see them on the screen.
Okay.
I don't know if the participants can see it, but I'll read the results.
Yeah, Betty, there may be a limit on the number of co-hosts that can see it on screen. So,
okay. Oh, I can see it, but I just hope that panel.
Yeah. So the first question, about 60% of the people said they did not know what were the historic red line neighborhoods, and about 40% said they did. And with this question, we're almost done with it. Most people have responded, and overwhelmingly 87% of the people responding said they do not live in one of the historically red line neighborhoods. So that lets us know who is on this webinar. Okay, let's move on to the next question. And this is a question about your civic engagement. Have you attended more than 5 public agency meetings in the last 6 months? So this means city council, school board, board of supervisors, air district meeting, water district meeting, anything like that. And so this is a gauge of how civically engaged our audience is. Okay, so at this point, we got about 83% of the people have participated, and 58% of the people said no. They have not attended more than 5 public agency meetings in the past 6 months, although a good 42% say they have. And so what that means is people need to step up their game. They need to get involved. They need to advocate. They need to challenge elected officials to do the right thing. Elected officials have no problem when coming out and asking us to vote for them. But many times we as a community, we as a people do not hold the elected officials accountable by attending these meetings and challenging their decisions. And so thank you. And then I think we have one more question, right? Yeah, and this will test the even more depth. Have you ever run for political office yourself? And let's see what those responses are. Should be fairly easy to answer. All right, so we have out of 82% of the participants here, 96% have said no. They have never run for political office. And only 4%, 3 out of 78 have. So it is a big task. It is a big leap. I personally ran for Richmond City Council when the Richmond Progressive Alliance first started in 2004. And because I was challenging particularly the police department as a victim of police violence during the 2002 Richmond police riot on Cinco de Mayo, I became the target of the hit pieces from the police union and the fire unions. So a rule of thumb is, if you're progressive, is never support a candidate who's backed by a law enforcement union. That means those people are going to sell you out and are going to put disproportionate amount of money into law enforcement and instead of prevention. So I think that's our last question, right?
Yeah, that is our last question. So now we can go into the question and answer portion of this, and you guys can have the opportunity to ask questions. So what we can do is you can ask them into the chat or type them into the chat, and I can read them out loud to Andres. You can also raise your hand and I can direct Andy to call on you. So there's already a comment, a question. So the question is as follows: corporations are prioritizing community outreach / social justice initiatives because they see it as good business. Unfortunately, their actions are often performative. Though checks, like checks and days in poor neighborhoods for employees. Though checks are good for covering operating costs, wouldn't providing contacts and technical expertise for thwarting polluting sites be a better way to engage? Can you comment on the type of support that would really matter for you?
Yeah, I would say tax the hell out of them and put that money into government and let the government decide where that money should go. We should never allow the corporations to determine where their money goes. What we've seen in Richmond is, since their defeat in the 2014 election, and Chevron has created a massive so-called philanthropic effort. And this is a tool of co-optation, where they co-opt people who receive their money, and then these people will line up, you know, including people of color and poor people, will line up and support, for example, Chevron when they're applying for permits. So, you know, a more appropriate system would be to tax the hell out of them and let our local elected representatives distribute those taxes through services directly to communities. And I see a question: how can I learn more about historically redlined neighborhoods in California? Start with Richard Rothstein's book, and then there are maps, and of course he goes into resources. Many times you'll see that there has already been research on this in the university type of environment, and you can get some of that. The real estate industry, the Realtors Association, apartment owners associations, and these kind of people don't want you to know this information, even though frequently they are people who have engaged in this kind of behavior. I see, how do you feel the completion of Highway 580 at the Richmond Bridge, which happened in the 80s, reshaped neighborhood demographics? What it did was it created a barrier between the new communities down in the Richmond Marina area, the Marina Bay area, and the historic African American community in the South Side. So it's like a tale of two cities separated by a freeway. And, you know, we can see the outcomes of the pollution impacting those different neighborhoods accordingly. And so what it did was it reinforced much of that red line discrimination and actually created it. Let's see, the next question is, There continues to be restrictive covenants on land owned by petroleum companies that limit these sites from being developed for affordable housing. What resources are there to challenge and overcome these private restrictive covenants? I really don't know the answer to that question. I think most of that has to be challenged in court. If there are identifiable restrictive covenants that exclude specific ethnic and racial groups, that can be challenged legally. And generally, what has happened, though, is that it's the lack of restrictive covenants or the restrictive covenants forced poor people, and frequently people of color, into the neighborhoods that are closest to these industrial facilities. And we've seen this all across the country. Although now, like in Richmond with the AstraZeneca site, what we're seeing is that there are people who want to build on these toxic sites as long as they don't have to clean them up all the way. And we have a notoriously corrupt state agency called the Department of Toxic Substance Control in the state of California that facilitates development on these kind of toxic sites. And we have a major battle of that right now with the state of California around this AstraZeneca site. A developer named Shopoff from Orange County wants to build 4,000 units on this land, and it would be only cleaned up to a point where people could only be exposed to the air there for 8 hours a day. Children cannot have preschool or schools there. You can't plant anything in the soil there. Everything would have to be in raised beds. So that is now subject to litigation. And then I see also that there is the suggestion about the color of law, the forgotten history, Richard Rothstein's book. And Veronica Eady points out that our own Kevin Olp at the Air District has a long history of understanding this and researching this, particularly in different parts of the country. So it's not unique. And then Julia Luongo has a link there to redlining, and it looks like it's from a university in Richmond. Maybe that's Richmond, Virginia. I'm not sure. And then the question, at this point in the trajectory of the climate crisis, what do you think is the best tactic for attempting to shift these industrial and government actors who are continuing with business as usual? Well, there are many tactics. There is no single tactic. One is to tax them more and to get them now to start paying into funds that will clean up their sites once they leave. We saw with the PES refinery in Philadelphia, because the refineries, like the Chevron Richmond refinery, is an LLC. It's owned as a subsidiary of the larger Chevron Corporation. So if Chevron wanted to shut down the refinery in Richmond tomorrow, they could shut it down and walk away, and the people of Richmond would be stuck with having to clean it up, just like we saw in Philadelphia. So we are doing that right now, the research on what are the various financial instruments that can hold industries accountable today, as opposed to them walking away, and then communities are stuck with this. And here in the Bay Area, a lot of the Bay Shore was industrialized in the early and mid 20th century, and so the shoreline of the Bay is filled with these toxic kind of sites, and Richmond is no different. And in fact, I would say in your own communities, you need to start doing this kind of research about your companies and what can be done now to get them to be accountable, not only for their current pollution, but when they ultimately shut down. And then what are ways communities can support, Aaron Hannigan, what are ways that communities can support historically redlined neighborhoods? Well, this is a very big and complicated question, but one of them is diverting resources from things like police departments into communities that have been historically redlined, build up their infrastructure, And we also need, because in most of these communities, most of the people are renters. They are not the property owners. So we need to establish rent control and renter protection, so that once these neighborhoods get improved, the people who currently live there are not pushed out. And we see this happening all across the country. And it's what I call the Europeanization of our cities, where it used to be, the action was in the cities, but then we saw in the post-war period, white flight creating the suburbs and now exurbs. But for the last 20 years, we've been seeing gentrification happening back in the cities, and people can't afford to live there anymore. San Francisco is a classic example. So if we want to have diverse cities where different classes, economic classes of people and ethnicities can live, we have to put in renter protection in order to preserve that, while at the same time improving the infrastructure and investment, particularly in things like schools and parks that help make living there more healthy. And then Stephanie says, connect with your local librarians. Yes. And of course, in Richmond, we had a very corrupt government in the early 2000s, and led by a city manager named Isaiah Turner. And there was a $35 million deficit in a $100 million budget. And our library system was virtually destroyed. Every branch library was closed. The main library was only open up 20 hours a week. And that system has not yet fully recovered. And that is another example of the kind of investment we need to put into our community by taxing the hell out of these corporations and building up this kind of public infrastructure. And
I'm so sorry to stop you, but thank you so much for your responses. We have to get back to the main session, but this was great. This is so engaging, and I hope all the participants learned something new. I know I learned a lot. So yeah, thank you for being here. And we'll head over to the main session and we'll start that next program. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you.